Hey YouTube, what's up? Mike the Manic Geek here. Now today I'm going to be going over redoing the cable management in my personal rig here. And like I said last time, I'm going to be doing this by using some cable extensions. So I'm going to go over some of how I tackle dealing with the added length of cable extensions in a computer, and share with you guys some of the other general tips and tricks that I have as far as cable management goes. Hopefully it'll help you out with your next system build in the future. So what I'm using here today is a very basic cable kit. I was originally planning on going like sort of balls to the wall with this and using all kinds of different BitFenix cable extensions, but talks fell through with me attempting to get a hold of all of that. So I wound up having to do all of this out of pocket, and this is pretty typical of what most people would be able to afford and would probably get for their case anyway. So I'm going with their ATX 24-pin extension. I'm going with a 6-pin and 8-pin PCI Express extension because I am using a GTX 980 for the Win card, so it does have a different power layout than a typical card. And I'm also using one of the EPS 12-volt extensions that BitFenix provides. Now, they do make all of these kits in a bunch of different colors and patterns and things. But I'm going with the solid white one since I'm going for a dominantly black and white build here. Now, as far as tools that I'm going to be using, of course, zip ties, pair of snips for dealing with the added length of the plastic here. Thing of pliers just in case the zip tie isn't being cooperative or I'm having a hard time gripping it. And in my case, I'm also going to be using two sort of off the beaten trail tools, one of which being twist ties. I did manage to save several from the couple of Antec cases that I've reviewed, as well as some of just the bags of bread that I buy. And those are good for mapping out your cable runs and making sure that everything is going to be in place correctly before you go ahead and actually commit to using a zip tie here. I'm also going to be using some gloves. These are nitrile work gloves. The reason I'm using these is because I naturally have very oily skin, and it picks up a lot of dirt and residue around me, and it can and does transfer to white cables especially. Really any single braid cable like this, you're going to be dealing with some kind of dirt transfer. It just really shows on white, and I had to learn that the hard way with the previous set of extensions that I had for this build. So without further ado, let's get started on the management. Alright, so for the rest of this video, it's going to be kind of vloggy style. I apologize if this camera doesn't zoom particularly well. Now you'll see that some of my cables have already been run and managed here. This is all dominantly front I/O. So what I did was, because I'm not actually using the built-in fan speed controller on my case, this is a Fractal Design Define R5 by the way, I went ahead and managed everything as close to the top of the case as I could possibly get it, and have everything just run in a single clean loom down into the actual cable management area so that I could figure out what I wanted to do from there with the rest of the cables. Now you can also see this isn't a full recabling. I do have my hard drives managed over here, and I'll go ahead and show you guys a cleaner shot of what that looks like. Now, why am I not using the panels over here? Honestly, it's mostly because I had a solid state drive back here before, and I actually found that cable management wasn't particularly clean when I had it set up here. So I figured rather than having the hard drive cage here just holding the single hard drive, I would go ahead and put my SSD in there as well, and that is a HyperX solid state drive, 240 gig. I figured it just looked too pretty to leave back there. Now, the main thing that I'm going to be doing here in terms of addressing my cables is figuring out which ones I need to use first. So here I have a Molex cable that I'm going to be using. I have my PCI Express power cable here. I have my EPS 12-volt cable here, and then I have the ATX 24-pin. Because these are the ones that are going to need to be remanaged and dealt with accordingly. And as I go through this, I'll talk about the rest of all the cabling with you guys and like the different things that I do here. All right, so one real quick thing I wanted to point out here is some of you may have noticed this particular run of cables right here and wondering what the hell that even is. That is the front I/O for my computer. So if we come around over here, you can see on the bottom right here that my front I/O is just peeking out behind the motherboard tray. Now, this creates an effect of having minimal cables on display inside your case. And it actually looks much cleaner like this because this is dominantly, apart from the saber-tooth trim, of course, a black and white build. So the cabling right here, it winds up looking, I don't know, it winds up looking a little bit better when most of that is concealed like that. Plus, running those cables behind your motherboard isn't going to really interfere with anything. There's no EMI to worry about. That's all just power reset, hard drive activity lights, and stuff like that. The main thing you would want to be concerned about when running the cables behind your motherboard tray is making sure that the cables aren't going to get pinned onto anything that's going to scratch the insulation or tear through it, because if you get exposed connectors behind your motherboard, that can and will cause problems for you. So just keep in mind that if you're going to do this, be careful with it and be thoughtful of how you run the cables. But as you can see, what's going to wind up happening with these is the ties for the Define R5 here are basically going to wind up just holding it in place on the single loom there. But what you can do is, even assuming that your case doesn't have ties like a Fractal Design or a Cooler Master or whatever case, or even a Phanteks case, you will still have some kind of cable tie options over here, and you can use that to tie the cables in place to the point that you can have this nice clean run here without the need to put anything in any sort of undue stress. All right, so in the event that any of you get confused with this, you'd probably look at both of these 8-pin cables and go, am I going to plug this in wrong? There's a PCI cable and a CPU cable that's the same. How do I know which one to use? Essentially, this keying on the end here, each of these pins has a unique keying to them that meets the ATX standard for cables on your motherboard. You will not be able to plug these into the wrong spot. Unless you're just trying to like manhandle and force the cables in. There's pretty much no way that you're going to be able to get your PCI Express cable accidentally plugged into your motherboard header and vice versa. Like I said, unless there's something wrong with your connector ends on your graphics card or your motherboard. But yeah, they are keyed specifically to only go into one area, so you guys won't need to worry about that. All right, so next thing you're gonna wanna do when you're tackling cable extensions, you see what this one's doing right here? Yeah, I didn't do that myself. The reason these cables do this is because when they're shipped, they basically look something like that, or some iteration of that. They're folded. So when you first take your cable extensions out, you're going to need to do what's called train the cables. So basically all that means is you're going to be bending them back and forth and working out as much of that stuck position as you can. That way, when you go to manage your cables a bit later on and you figure out what you want to do with them, it's easier to see what's going on. Like even see here, these PCI Express cables have a bit of a natural kink in them at points from where they were packaged. So you just want to go ahead and make sure that you train your cables out as you go along, just to make sure that you get rid of as much of that bend as possible. Again, see how this cable is looking more or less straight at this point. I still have a little more teasing to go on this and training, but this will eventually wind up straightening out to the point that it will be largely cooperative. All right, so after I got all the cables trained out more or less the way I wanted them, I went ahead and ran the extensions first. And then after you run the extensions through, then you can start hooking in your main power supply cables. Mostly because the way I have the extensions run through now is more or less the way that I'm wanting them to look once the system is complete. So as I manage the cables in the back, I'm also going to be paying attention to what happens on the inside of the case in here, you know, how these cables wind up moving their way around and things like that, and using that to adjust how I'm going to do things around the other side here to keep everything not only hidden and practical, but also keep it looking nice at the same time. Now, there is one cable extension that I didn't go over with you guys earlier. This is another Alchemy extension by BitFenix. This is their pulse width modulated fan extension. They make these in varying lengths, and they make them for 3-pin and 4-pin fans as well. I went with this particular extension because between the two fans that I have in the front here, by the way, huge thank you to Fractal Design for helping me kit out this case with Venturi fans. It's seriously probably the best decision that I ever made for this case. They are absolutely made for each other. So I have a Venturi HP14 on my H140X kit, and I have 3 HF140s in the case, 2 in the front here, and then 1 in the roof as exhaust. And I'll go over my decision for that in a later video. But for right now, let's keep going on with the cable management. Okay, so we've hit another stopping point here, and I wanted to sort of go over with you guys what I've done. Now, you can see right here how I have these cables sort of looping up, then back down, then going out through the cable grommet and meeting up with the motherboard right here. This is a lot of why I suggest putting the extensions on first, mostly because, you know, everything that I mentioned earlier, but it also makes it easier for you, like I said, determine what exactly is going on with the lengths of the cables. Now, when you start actively managing everything, don't pull these cables particularly taut. You want them to look like it's a nice tight run, but you don't want them overly tight, because especially with these heat shrinkless extensions here, the more stress gets put on these over time, the more likely the end is to start separating from the cable. And that does actually look really bad when that happens. So just sort of keep that in mind when you manage the cables here. Now, another thing that I wanted to point out real quick was this little guy right here. Now, this is an extra set of PCI cables that are integrated into this power supply that I can't really do anything with because I don't have another card to plug into them. So, in order to sort of start getting this out of the way, you see I looped it back behind the 24-pin extension cable here. Since this is the bulkiest cable in the case, looping it back around here is going to make sure that this cable is just entirely out of the way for the rest of this cable management experience. All right, so I got to a point in my cable management where I got the chance to use a twist tie so I could show you what exactly I do with those. So you can see right here I got the twist tie in place for my EPS 12 volt connector. And the reason for that is because I'm trying to get the loom up top there to look as clean as I can possibly get it. But what happens is as you put more stress on the cables behind the motherboard tray, and as you go to tie everything in place, these cables can start to, they don't stay together anymore. So the goal is to set them up where you want them to be in terms of functionality and looks. Remember that this has to be a form meets function kind of or affair here, otherwise what the hell was the point? So you want to get it in a place where it looks visually appealing, but it's still more or less easy to work with. And as you guys can see here, I have also taken my EPS 12 volt and run it behind the 24-pin cable as well to make sure that I was going to get minimal bunching right here to make it easy for the side panel to go back on. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to attempt to run a zip tie with this twist tie still in place to get everything where I want it, and then just undo the twist tie and remove it so that everything stays in place and I don't have to go through an unnecessary amount of zip ties while I'm taking care of all of this. Okay, so real quick, I wanted to show you guys how exactly I'm powering the 3 case fans in my system. So
I have this 4-pin extension that I told you guys about earlier for 4-pin pulse width modulated fans. I'm basically daisy chaining 2 of the Y connectors that come with the Venturi high pressure fans to run my 2 HF14s in the front, as well as my HF14 in the roof here. This motherboard, it's a Asus Sabertooth 990FX R2.0, in case you guys didn't catch that. But it is capable of controlling all of these fans, despite them being 3-pin off of a 4-pin header. So kudos to Asus for again, rock solid fan speed control. I have been running this configuration for a couple of days now safely. It doesn't give me any issues whatsoever. The thing about the cable, though, is you can see the connector right here has kind of an awkward shape. They didn't really design this with a standard 4-pin cable layout in mind, so I basically just kind of jammed the cable in place. It's not actually hurting anything, it's just sort of bending that cable connector out a little bit. You could probably trim that back with your snips right here if you really wanted to, but I would try and forego that route and just sort of plug the cable in. BitFenix, what were you thinking here, guys? Come on. Come on. All right, guys, so I'm more or less wrapped up here with the cable management. I'll go ahead and show you guys some of the fine-tuning stuff that I did here. First of all, you can see that the twist tie familiar is replaced with a zip tie here. So I got that loom looking more or less the way I wanted to in the front of the case. This is the connector for power to my H140X pump. Now you notice I'm using an adapter here from Molex to, or rather from SATA power to 4-pin Molex. Now the reason I did this is because I already had a Molex connector that I was going to have in place powering the light for my H140X kit, because unfortunately for some reason this kit's lighting does not play well with the fan headers for the Asus motherboard, and I wanted to get that cable largely out of the way. So I just went with this Molex connector here, and since I already have all the SATA that I'm ever going to need for this particular build just right here, it really didn't seem particularly worthwhile to add a whole nother SATA cable like this to make my cable management that much more difficult. So I just happen to have this lying around. If you guys wanted to pick up something like this, they are dirt cheap. You can probably pick up an extension like this for a couple of bucks on Amazon or something like that. They don't need to be, you know, they don't need to have fancy braiding on them or anything. They just need to work. Now, you'll also notice that there are some cables that just flopping around. They don't have anything tying them down directly. And that's because you don't have to do that with every single cable. You do not have to tighten everything to something. But bear in mind, you can tie things to themselves in certain instances if you need to keep your management nice and tight in here and in a single loom, like what I have going here along the grommets for the Define R5. Ultimately, the straps and the slight concave design that the motherboard tray has does make this easier to manage cables. But you can achieve looms similar to this even outside of a Fractal Design case if you really wanted to. This just happens to be what my system is built in, so that's what I have to work with here. I will be doing this for different form factors in the future as and when I get the funds to do so. But you can see right here why I wanted to omit the solid state drive caddies in the back, because the way the cable management was going to have to work for this, I was going to need to use openings that are... I was going to have to use some of the cable tie openings that essentially just would have otherwise been in the way if I had a solid state drive mounted back here. And it would have separated the cabling from the cabling over here, and you can see where that would have made a little bit of a management nightmare there, and I would have had more cables in the system than I absolutely needed. Same thing with this cable down here as far as not being tied in place. It's in a coil and in the corner, out of sight, out of mind. You know, even the same with this little bit. Yes, I could tie this right here. Matter of fact, I probably will, just for peace of mind's sake, but it's largely going to stay in place. You don't need to actually tie that down to anything. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and do a test for you guys to see if the side panel will actually close like this. All right, so here it is, moment of truth time. Time to get the side panel back on. So let's see if this will actually close on my first effort. Do you see what wound up becoming the culprit? You see that? Bad. Bad cable. All right, now that we got the cable fixed, let's try this again. Boom, there we have it. Just wanted to give you guys a quick glossing over to just recap what it is we did here. We got the 8-pin EPS 12 volt cable routed. We have our 4-pin pulse width modulated fan cable installed and running our 3 case fans. This guy right here and these 2 up front. Then we also have our ATX 24-pin cable. Still got a little bit more training to do on this to try and get it to do exactly what I'm wanting it to do, but that's more or less about as good as it's going to get. And then we have our PCI Express cables. Now, what you guys will notice here is I've got this little strap tie right here on these cables, and they seem to be doing their job extremely well as far as trailing goes. That's because that particular cable is actually hooked onto the graphics card. On the side of the GTX 980 for the Win ACX 2.0 coolers, there are 2 little slots on the side of the heatsink here that you can use as anchor points for your cables. And this zip tie is not on there particularly tight. As a matter of fact, none of the zip ties for this case are particularly tight. You want to remember to not over tighten your zip ties when you cable manage, because what that can happen is it'll make it difficult for your side panels to close, because all of the tension on those cables is going to be making them bulge up on either side of the zip tie. And really, you just need them to stay in place. You don't need them to be like in a vice grip like hold here. And that's exactly how I'm able to get my side panel to close readily. That's how I'm getting all of the cables to run as cleanly as possible. And using all of the grommeted openings as and when they're supposed to be used. Guys, I cannot emphasize enough how important these openings are. The proper cable management. They're there for a reason. Use them in your build. The only time you have an excuse is when the cables are too short. Even down here, when we're looking at the audio and USB 2 connectors, using the tools that are supplied by Fractal Design. I mean, they did a really good job of designing this case, as I mentioned in my review of it. Use those tools. Even if you're not building in a Define R5, you have tools available to you to make your cable management as spot on as you can possibly make it. But that's going to do it for this video. Guys, let me know down in the comments below what you thought about this particular style for my videos. I'm trying something a little different here, and I'm not really sure exactly how this is going to turn out, but definitely let me know what you thought down in the comments below. Be sure to do that thumbs up, thumbs down, share, subscribe thing like you guys do, how you do. Also, be sure to follow me on Twitter. I'm @TheManicGeek. And until next time, guys, take it easy.